What if the tension that you're feeling in leadership isn't random? And the friction between you and your board, the lack of clarity around expectations, and the fear of making the wrong call? What if that's not just part of the job? What if it's a sign that something foundational is missing? Welcome. This is our season opener of the Life After Ministry podcast, and we sit down with an esteemed guest, John Pearson, a leader who has spent decades inside boardrooms, transitions, and some of the most influential ministries in the country. And what he surfaces is both simple and unsettling. You know, most ministry challenges don't start with a crisis. They start with a lack of clarity, a gap between decision-making and discernment, unspoken expectations between boards and leaders, and a system that was never really clearly defined in the first place. If you've ever walked out of a board meeting frustrated, if you've ever felt like you're carrying the weight all by yourself, and if you've ever wondered why things feel harder than they should, this might be the most important conversation you've listened to this year. And honestly, it might be the one that you forward to your board chair. Welcome. This is the Life After Ministry podcast, and this is John Pearson. Well, John Pearson, welcome. This is the Life After Ministry podcast. I've been looking forward to having this conversation with you for a while.
My privilege, Matt. I've enjoyed listening to many of the podcasts already, so you have had some wonderful conversations. I'm looking forward to this one.
Yeah. You were telling me that you've listened to some of the conversations here, and you might be giving my wife a run for the money, and I'll have to let her know that she needs to start listening to a few more of these as well. As I was looking through, man, your bio is massive, and so can't even do it justice, but you have been in really organizational leadership and ministry, looking at topics like board governance. You've consulted some of the most influential and necessary ministries that are helping all of the other ministries out there for so many years. You've served in the seat of CEO. You've been as diverse as Willow Creek Association, as well as Christian Camping, where I got my first ministry years were started in camp ministry and getting dirty in teepees and playing worship with kids and in fire circles and fun stuff like that. One thing I realized, though, as I was looking at who you are, what you've done, and you've connected with the guys on our team, and we consider you a friend of ministry transitions and what we're doing here. It's interesting that you have been witness to a lot of change in ministry, not just how ministries change, but I was even just looking at you. At one point in your experience, you were the president of Willow Creek Association, and then it says now Global Leadership Network. And there were several organizations that you've been a part of over the years that once were named this one thing, and now they're named something totally different. And the name is obviously not the only thing that changed. But as you look back over years and decades of ministry, sometimes we say that change is the only constant. But how have you seen change take place in the ministry setting, in the ministry world? And does it oftentimes reveal progress or regress?
Matt, I read an article once that said you should never say to somebody, "That's a great question," because when they ask another question and you don't say, "That's a great question," then they'll say, "Well, what was wrong with that question?" But
Sure.
Thank you. That was a great question. I'm going to break my own rule. Boy, over the years, and I'm an old guy, so I've seen a lot of transition. I've seen leaders who are narcissistic. I've seen extremely humble leaders. I've seen organizations that resisted any kind of changes, sacred cows. But I think the thing that encourages me is there's a deep hunger for spiritual discernment that I wish I had known in my CEO years. In 2006, I started consulting with all these ministries I'd worked with in 3 different associations. And I started seeing boards and staff teams literally on their knees, spiritually discerning God's voice, hearing from God. And as part of that, um, everybody just like, wow, look what God just did. So that there was a humility and I would say that, um, as I look back on my ministry mistakes, I think pretty good at decision making. I read books on decision making, went to seminars on decision making, but I really didn't understand spiritual discernment. So I started reading books from like Steve Macchia and Ruth Haley Barton. And, and so today I sense that even though ministries still have challenges and problems and they're chasing after funds rather than chasing after what Henry Blackaby says, find out what God is doing and then join him. You know, the money, the money thing shouldn't be the problem if we're doing what God has called us to do. In spite of that, I'm encouraged that there's a greater humility before the Lord and that people are deeply desiring to not build kingdoms their own, but to honor God. Now, that's a great question. I could probably write a pretty good article on that of 10 things I've noticed, and maybe I'll do that someday.
Yeah. Um, you mentioned making mistakes, that you've made your own mistakes. You even wrote a book called Mastering Mistake Making, My 25 Memorable Mistakes and What I Learned. And I'd like to maybe even hit on a couple of those, but how afraid should a leader be? I'm actually working with a a person who is moving into the executive director or presidential role, is currently in a president-elect position, and one of the things that he's bumping up against is fear. Uh, Looking at his predecessor and the shoes he's about to step in, I think the fear is making a mistake, not doing it the same way that the person who was there before. And so do you just encourage people, just go for it, and if you're going to make a mistake, go big? What is the counterbalance to making sure that we have the permission to make mistakes and not something that's going to sink the ship?
Another good question. um,
I was hoping
here's
you'd say
here's
that.
the challenge. Peter Drucker, the father of modern management, said people who take risks tend to make about 2 big mistakes a year. People who don't take risks tend to make about 2 big mistakes a year. So
Uh,
he certainly was on the side of be thoughtful, but don't be fearful of making mistakes. And during COVID, little time on my hands, and I'm retired. And my wife said to me once, John, you read all these books and you write a little book review of them and a little newsletter. Uh, would these books have made any difference when you were a CEO leading those 3 different associations and running camps and whatever? And I started thinking about that, and she always wants answers. By the way, has her strongest spiritual gift is discernment, which is very tough to be married to.
right.
But it's good. Um, so what I did during COVID is I wrote this book on mastering mistake making, 25 mistakes. And so I said, here's a mistake I made. Then here's a book I read later in life. If I had only read that book sooner, some of them weren't written back then, but uh, maybe I wouldn't have made that mistake. And here's what I learned. And part of my learning curve dramatically changed during COVID was I stumbled across all this mistake making literature. And I've started now when I read a book, and I'm the reader type, as a lot of people listen to books. And so Drucker, in fact, used to say, you got to figure out if you're a reader or a listener. So I just put a little M with a circle around it in the margin of books that I'm reading now that talk about mistake making. And all the literature, all the business literature, ministry literature is saying the worst mistake is to learn from your mistake. So don't let mistakes bother you. Your board of directors, your people, your congregation, your team in your ministry, give them the freedom to make mistakes, but learn from them. And in the book, there's several examples of, $1 million mistakes, not that I made, but that others have made, and how they've learned that. One guy made $1 million mistake, and his boss said, and he said, here's my resignation. And the boss says, we just gone to school on your $1 million mistake. I'm not going to, that's the tuition we paid. I'm not going to fire you now. Now you know not to do that, and you'll be a much better team member. So, in ministry transitions, oh my goodness, the mistakes. I mean, we've all seen them, the horror stories. Steve Woodworth's excellent podcast he did with you and his book on Lost in Transition, disastrous. So why don't we read that stuff and learn, but still venture out, try to do something a little differently than you've done before. With the right heart, God will be honored. Don't worry about making mistakes.
Yeah, you were gracious enough and sent me your book, and I attached myself to mistake number 5. Thinking leadership is learned by magic. I missed the memo about focusing on results and SMART goals. And you said the actual mistake was that I naively thought that if you held a leadership position, you could somehow magically learn leadership. Why is this so important, and how often are we caught in this mistake in leadership positions?
Well, it's rampant, sadly. But the solution in that particular mistake was I began to understand why we should focus on results. And so in ministry transitions, for example, if a board says, I think it's time for our pastor to move on, I would guess that it's often because the board and the senior pastor, or the ministry board and the CEO, have not agreed on what results we're seeking. Peter Drucker was big on results. In my book on the 20 management buckets, the first bucket is the results bucket. And so I encourage, I'm not the only one, I encourage every leader to have 5 SMART goals, 5 annual SMART goals that every board member and every team member, if you meet them in the hallway saying, so what are your leaders' 5 SMART goals? They could share them. But I've done a ton of workshops over the years with ministry leaders, church boards, and I'll ask everybody, I said, okay, I got a Starbucks card here. The last one standing gets this Starbucks card. And so I'll have everybody stand, and then I'll start going through some questions. If you know one of your leaders' SMART goals, SMART as the acronym SMART, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, time related. If you can remember one of your leaders' SMART goals that is written in the minutes and affirmed by the board, remain standing. Well, 90% of the room sits down. And then the next question is, I'll start asking people, I said, can you give it to me in one sentence with a period? And they'll say, and other people from their organization will be with them, and they'll say, sit down, Joe, sit down. And I've literally only given away about 10 Starbucks cards over 20 years in doing that exercise, which is sad. But So yeah, if you're the leader, you got the title, you got the desk, you got the office, but the way you'll stay the leader, it's a simple thing, is just can you get on your knees and ask the Lord, what ought to be my 3, 4, 5 major goals? Drucker would say, if you've got more than 5 goals, you got none. And so can our board and staff and leader work together on that to discern what the key thing should be? And then everybody in their organization needs to have 3 to 5 SMART goals. I'm blessed that you zeroed in on that, Matt, because it really is. That probably should have been part of my answer to your first question. It's the missing link in most ministries, and it's often why leaders don't make it in their current role. But the mistake will be repeated and repeated and repeated. You get the new leader, you do a nice ministry transition and a welcome reception and get the new letterhead. But if there's no focus on results, it's just a lot of activity. Oh my. So
It's interesting because I think we just tend to, in all of our human relationships, we just think that magic, or give it enough time, that we'll just naturally. I thought the same thing about marriage early on, that I'll just naturally pick up on it. And you realize, like, if anyone who is doing well in a certain, area of life, if they are a marathon runner and their body is absolutely in shape, it took work. It wasn't magic. If somebody is an incredible speaker and communicator, they weren't just born with it. There is a natural gifting, but there's also something that needs to be developed in that entire process. And so I do think that we have to pay attention to that. And when I see leaders who just think that if I can actually just have enough meetings with people, or if I can, get a book in, but you're talking about a very proactive role, not just in doing the role, whether that's a board or somebody in an executive leadership position within their organization. But we have to be intentional about those things if we want to be good. And I think in a world of mediocrity, a lot of us have settled for just okay, or kind of checking the box. And this is what happens. And because there often isn't a financial metric in the ministry world, I think sometimes we just settle for this is okay. And so I think it's an important piece. Who are some of those people that you see in the ministry world that are taking that on? And maybe even my bigger curiosity question is, it you just assigned some tasks to a board member, other than their monthly or quarterly meeting of just showing up. So what does that actually look like in the day and life and the routine of ministry?
well, when I do training with boards, and I want to be clear, I'm been trying to retire for about 10 years. So, um, I, I just, Lord, what is it today? And, in 2018, I started just working half days and gave my wife the opportunity to have full veto power over any inquiry or any client. But I still have the opportunity occasionally we say yes to some working with some boards. In working with boards, I did a series of toolboxes for ECFA called the board ECFA governance toolbox series, and one of them on board roles. And I literally would have 3 hats: one called governance, one called volunteer, and one called participant. And so part of the dilemma that happens in boardrooms is that many board members are recruited onto the board inappropriately because they were good volunteers. But it doesn't mean that they're gifted at discerning God's voice on matters of what I call the corporation, the community, and the cause. And so they often begin to do things that are more like staff roles. So the leader and the board chair need to be very careful not to assign to board members work that really should be a staff or a staff role. Or if they do it, they should make it crystal clear. Um, Joan is doing this because she's really gifted as a volunteer, and she's going to work with another person on our staff. And so Joan is not going to bring her report to the board just because she's a board member. She's going to give the report back to a staff person. So if that's kind of, if I'm clear on what you were asking, that's where it often goes amok. And even in the ministry transition world of a leader leaving and a new leader coming, sometimes boards can get out of their lane and not stay in the appropriate board role. And that also is a critical piece of smoothing the way for beautiful God honoring transitions. If boards really understand their role during transition times.
So being on boards and going through some of your own ministry transitions, as you look back, what are some of the things that you would have done differently now knowing what you know?
Oh my. My whole life.
Mm.
uh, uh, I when I when I was a very young camp director in Bellevue, Washington, it was the second camp that I was the director of. I was director of a camp while I was at seminary in Illinois, and learned a lot there. But now I was executive director of a camp in Bellevue, Washington, and one of my board members came to me and said, "John, it's not clear what my role is and what the staff's role is." He was manager of long range planning at Boeing in Seattle. I mean, high level guy. Blessed that he was willing to be on the camp board. And he said, we use this little chart called the prime responsibility chart at Boeing. And I think if we did that here at, the name of the camp was Sambika, short for Sammamish Bible Camp. We were on Lake Sammamish in Bellevue. I think this would clarify things. Well, I can't tell you how many times I have used that one-page prime responsibility chart to clarify the role between the CEO or senior pastor, the board chair, the board, the finance person, the program person. And it's even in a book that ECFA published called with 22 Tools and Templates that when Dan Busby was still with us, we did several books together on board governance. And so I hear a lot of people say, well, we got to keep board members in their lane, but I never hear anybody get to the next point of saying, so here's a practical template or tool that you can use. And that's what we tried to do for boards, because I knew nothing. I had no experience. My first job as CEO and first time I'd worked with a board, I'd been to a lot of board meetings from very young, high school and college. People would mentor me and bring me, why don't you sit in on this board meeting? Then when I led these 3 different associations with the Christian Camps and Willow Creek Association, and then what's now called Christian Leadership Alliance, we would always survey our members asking, what are your 3 greatest needs? And Matt, every year for over 25 years, one of the top 3 needs was that the CEOs, senior pastors would respond. Working with my board, it's just like crazy. So I invited lots of consultants and kind of gurus and experts to write articles, speak at the workshops in the national convention on board governance, and that's where I learned it all. And then I've just taken their ideas and tried to make them my own and hand them out. But immediately when we talk about these areas with board members, the lights come on, and it's just that you don't know what you don't know until you are exposed to it. So, how do you become better at board governance when you have no experience? You got to get some training, read some books, talk to some experts, etc. So I would encourage listeners to jump in. I think I heard you on a podcast with you did it with the wonderful person from um, the university out here. You're uh, you're doing it. You're doing a workshop with at CLA, right?
Oh yeah, Dr. Dee Dee Meyer. Yeah, she's over at Pepperdine.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. I think on that podcast that I listened to, Matt, it was like you are needing some encouragement to get a little more excited about board governance as a ministry leader. And I get that. I mean, I totally get that. And that's why it's so important to bring people onto the board, because some people do have high passion for it. And if you don't, probably shouldn't be on a board. So
let's dig into this a little bit more, because it's funny that you bring that up. You know, I'll be doing at the CLA Christian Leadership Alliance conference. I'll be doing a breakout session with Dr. Mayer, who has just been appointed the chaplain at Pepperdine. And she's an incredible mind, and her dissertation work was on these 9 essential questions that every board needs to be asking. It was also at CLA last year that I got reacquainted with one of my old Biola Talbot seminary profs, Dr. Michael Anthony, who wrote a book on the 20 essential ministry or not nonprofit board questions that need to be addressed. And so these are the absolutely essential things. And then those are 2 people that have in the last year said, we need to write a book together. And I thought, can we do something maybe a little bit more fun than board governance? I don't know if I want to be involved as the board governance guy. But I think it's interesting, because as we are working in this area of ministry transition, it seems to be that the people, whether you're a pastor or a nonprofit leader, those who want to get out, right? We'll get emails randomly. They'll just say, "That's it, I'm done," and it's usually the day after a board meeting that they've just hit the ceiling,
yes.
and they don't know what to do. Or oftentimes we have board members who are coming to us, and now that they feel the heat, they're starting to see the light. And I find that this is an interesting piece, because I also have a nonprofit of my own. And what we often want in the ask is we want somebody who's good and qualified, but they oftentimes don't have a lot of time. So we want to make the ask as easy as possible. But the downside of that is that you end up getting boards, and we see this with much larger organizations too. But you have boards who are all in, love the mission, love the people, but they don't really know the ministry, especially like how the sausage is made on the inside. And it continues to surface this issue for us at Ministry Transitions, that we are certainly trying to help do what we can on we're primarily working in the area of aftermath. What do we do, after the defecation has hit the oscillation, essentially, right? Where people are coming to us after things have been made a mess. And so we really, and as much as we want to be equipped to help them out and do that's great. That's a calling for sure. We would also like to proactively see where can we help prevent some of these issues. And here's the hardest part. And so I've actually been clamoring a little bit to talk to you about this. Is it's hard to get to a place where boards gather, because we have pastor conferences, there's nonprofit leadership conferences. There aren't really ministry board conferences. They don't gather. They're, even from a marketing perspective, it's a really tough category to hit. Like, if we have a message to get out to the boards of the world, to board members of the world, where do they live, right? Like, they're not claiming this most of the time on their LinkedIn status. This is not showing up. They're not board conferences. And we ask ourselves, well, should we throw a board conference? And then we think, well, would anybody even come? And so being in this space for as long as you have, certainly you can read a book, but man, I'm just curious, like, would do they read that? I know there's a certain percentage who would. How do we reach boards so that we can help boards, so that we can help ministries? I know I just threw out about 40 questions, but that's the question.
Uh, Great questions. ECFA, you did a podcast with ECFA. They have uh, contact info for almost all the board members of ECFA accredited members, both churches and organizations. And
Mm.
for about 10 years, I wrote a blog about once a week for ECFA on governance of Christ-centered organizations. And I could tell the readership was pretty high. It seemed to be touching a need. Maybe the pastor or the CEO might grab it first and then send the link out to the board members as part of the regular. I encourage boards to, even if you don't meet monthly, at least send a CEO should, or senior pastor should send a monthly update. It's one of the tools in that book called the 515 report. It takes 15 minutes to write and 5 minutes to read, so board members will read it. Um, so there are some smaller foundations that have uh, started programs of training board members, but there is no national Christ-centered organization. There is a, a secular organization called Board Source. It used to be called the National Center for Nonprofit Boards. You can just go to boardsource.org, and there are faith-based ministries that are members of that, and they have very good material. But when you get to decision making, they're not talking about spiritual discernment because that's not on their radar. And so, should the National Association be started for that? I think I would say if you were to poll the CEOs of 10 of the leading associations like Citygate Network for Rescue Missions, CLA, Christian Camp and Conference Association, Evangelical Press Association, um, I think some kind of a coming together of those leaders who all work with leaders who have boards, um, you may come up with something. So if God is continue to put that on your heart for you and Ron and Bill and others, I'll cheer you on. I won't do any of the work, but I'll cheer you on.
It's something that continues to show up, and we'll see. The Lord hasn't said do it yet, but we're leaning in, and our hope is that we want to be able to bridge the gap and bridge the divide between. It's interesting. I read a book called Unreasonable Hospitality, talking about there's a level that goes beyond service, and it's called hospitality, by a guy named Will Guidara. But he talks about how you have the people he owned a very popular restaurant in Manhattan, New York. But he talks about how the people who are front of house, who are serving the customers, they have all the knowledge. And you have the people in the head offices, in the main offices, who have all the power, but none of the knowledge. And so how do we actually bridge this divide between those who have the knowledge, those who have the power, and they don't operate in these silos, but we have to somehow bring them together. And I think that that's probably the work that's needed, not just from an organizational standpoint, but kingdom wise, right? Like this is that if the mission is as important as it is, and we believe it is, then we have to do something to be able to solve this issue that we're experiencing in the church. One of the things that you describe is one of your top 10 spiritual experiences and how it shaped your entire leadership philosophy. And it's probably not something that most people would attribute as a spiritual experience. Can you walk us through it?
I had privilege of doing some consulting for a rescue mission in Seattle. And then the leader was retiring, and the board chair asked me if I would consider doing the search for their next leader. And I said, there's some really great search firms out there. I'm not a search guy. And he kept pressing. And I prayed and finally said, okay, I'll do it, but I need help with an actual real search firm. And so we partnered. Well, it came to the day of my job was to have three really credible candidates, either one, any one of the three that could be successful at taking the job. And I felt this is a really hard decision the search committee is going to have. And so we met, one for breakfast, one for lunch, and one for dinner. At lunch, the person selected was a guy named Jeff. And as Jeff was talking, I had this holy sense that I'm the consultant there, like almost what the Lord lifted up my arm and said, "This is the one." And I mean, it was clear. And I thought, well, Lord, we still haven't had the interview with the guy for dinner yet. It's not fair to him. And I thought, well, this is interesting. And I said, I don't have a vote, Lord. So you're going to have to tell everybody. There were 4 committee members. You're going to have to tell them. So we have dinner with the third candidate. And then after he left, and then after dinner, we said, well, where do you want to start? And immediately one of the women on the committee said, well, I don't know what you're thinking, but when we were meeting with Jeff at lunch, I felt like the Lord said to me, he's the one. And I remember she said to one of the committee members, and I remember what you said, that it would be a train wreck if we had him because he's not from the rescue mission profession. And the guy's name was Bill, and Bill said, no, I didn't say it would be a train wreck. I said it would be an absolute train wreck if we picked him. But during lunch, God said to me, Jeff is the one. And everybody around the table told that story. And then the board chair who served on the search committee said, okay, so we're going to recommend Jeff to the full board now. Is that correct? John, will you call Jeff and let him know? And he said, and just to be sure, and here's where the spiritual discernment, where I was privileged to have this front row seat of people who loved the Lord and just wanted to hear God's voice. The board chair, Andy, said, why don't we all sleep on it? And then everybody call John in the morning if you're still convinced that Jeff is the one. So I checked in with each one in the morning, and then I called Jeff. He was at the San Francisco airport, I remember. I caught him, and I said, there's good news and bad news. The good news is they want you, but the bad news is I think they think you're Jesus. and Jeff said, well, you know what they did with Jesus? They crucified him.
That's right.
Well, fast forward then, Matt, a year later, they invited me, and Jeff came and served. They invited me to come and facilitate his 1-year review, his evaluation. How have you done after a year? And one of the guys on the committee, the board, Bill, said to the chair, Andy, before we start this review, can I just say this? And I pulled it out. It's in the book, Lessons from the Nonprofit Boardroom. But he said this: before we start, I just want to remind us all to think back a year ago when we were interviewing the final 3 candidates, including Jeff, and God met us in that interview room. I will go to my grave remembering that holy moment as one of the top spiritual experiences of my life. And I got this new vision for what board members can experience to see God at work like I'd never been before. That's not to say that all the other searches, and I just did a couple other searches, but I didn't do many, that they were as easy. I mean, easy. But it just reminded me that the Lord, this is what the Lord wants to do for our ministries in the transitions, in exiting people, whether they're retiring or being terminated or they're resigning on their own to go somewhere else. And then for the next person, God doesn't want all the all the stuff that people are calling you about every week. Like, I can't believe what my board just did to me. That doesn't honor God. There is a way. And I think huge percent of it is the humility of just saying to the Lord, this is your ministry. It's not mine. And, we want to hear from you. So, Matt, I love what you and the team are doing at Ministry Transitions. It is so needed. And I hope that this message has a holy ripple effect very soon.
Thank you. I truly appreciate the time, John. You are such a reader, and you divided up, and we kind of covered them in different ways, maybe without people knowing. But your big passion topics are books, buckets, and boards, and I love it. I love if you want to get lost for a day or even a year, we're going to push you towards one of your sites and everything touches everything else, and everything's hyperlinked. So there's just another rabbit trail that you can go on, and they're all really good walks if you want to go on those. But after reviewing 650 plus leadership and management books, and you are incredibly well read. If there was one book that you would say that you would recommend, and so I'm really going to go for two though. One book for somebody sitting in the board chair, and then somebody who's sitting in the leadership seat running a ministry. What would those two books be that you would push them towards?
I really resist narrowing it down to one or two books. That's really tough. I actually have written about that. Every year in my e-newsletter, it's called Your Weekly Staff Meeting. At the end of every year, it doesn't come out weekly, but 2 or 3 times a month, I review a book in that e-newsletter, and anybody can sign up for it. So at the end of the year, I identified my top 10 books and my book of the year. Okay. My book of the year for 2025 was Gentle and Lowly. And you can go to my site and figure it out. It's a spiritually based thing. I'm thinking my book of the year for 2026 will be one I haven't read yet, because when Kurt Swindoll was on your podcast and talked about the book With, my wife was very intrigued. And so we got the book, and she's looking at it, and she doesn't read many books. Because I read most of my books to her. She's had plenty of books from me. Board chairs, there's all kinds of books for board members. David McKenna wrote a book that I urge every board chair to read called Call of the Chair. And it has to do with when you've been nominated to be the board chair, okay, time out. Now's time for a holy moment where the board should pause and ask, has God selected you to be the board chair? I've never been in a boardroom before reading that book where anybody had done that. It's the guy's out of the room and they nominate him to be the next board chair, or the woman who's got 25 things going on, and but you get it done. So, please do it. For a CEO, I just happened to come across this book, be reminded of this book again today. And maybe this is what the Lord would want me to mention. Dr. Hans Fenzel wrote a book called The Power of Passion in Leadership. Lead from your heart, not just your head. And it's a very thin book, and it is so good. And he's got 12 bullet points of when it's time to leave. And he said, my passion had left the building, and he talked about his transitions. I'd love to hear him on your podcast to kind of talk about the book, Power of Passion in Leadership. So maybe those two. But if you go to my website, you'll see, and you'll get a link over to where I I dropped the book reviews. I've got the book of the year links since 2006. So
That's great.
it's some call it an obsession, Matt, and I apologize, but I kind of stumbled into it and I can't stop.
I love it. What's the website we want to send people to?
Just go to managementbuckets.com, managementbuckets.com, and you can email me from there. And then there's a link to my books and blogs, and you can go to where I posted my blogs.
That's great. Well, John, thank you for joining us on the Life After Ministry podcast. Thank you for years of investment and wisdom. I think I told you before we hit record that here we were thinking that we were being very novel and thinking of some new things. And then we start to read all of yours and realize that this has been around all this time and that there is nothing new under the sun. But thankfully, that there's alignment, and very thankful for your legacy of work and your body of work, and getting to continue that in this generation for ministry and for the kingdom. So blessed to have you here.
Thank you.
There's something steady beneath the entire conversation I just got to have with John. It's the realization that most ministry breakdowns don't begin with one massive big moment. They begin with small misalignments, unclear expectations. There's a lack of shared direction, and often there is a drift away from listening for God's voice together. And what stands out is this, that clarity and discernment are not luxuries in leadership, they're necessities. When boards and leaders slow down long enough to seek alignment, not just on strategy, but on calling, then something changes. Fear begins to loosen its grip. Decisions carry more peace, and transitions, even the hard ones, can reflect the heart of God instead of the strain of all of our human effort. If this conversation stirs something and you don't carry it alone, reach out to John and check out all of his resources at managementbuckets.com. And we are always open for a conversation, whether you're a board member, whether you are a Christian CEO and business owner, or you're leading an organization, or you're number 2 in the organization trying to figure out what do we do and how do we start to steer the ship in the right place. We want to be able to help. And all of our conversations are absolutely confidential. And so we invite you to reach out. You can get me an email at talk@ministrytransitions.com or visit our website, ministrytransitions.com, and we will be sure to connect very soon. Thanks for listening. My name is Matt Davis, and this is the Life After Ministry podcast.